We may get into that in terms of like the federal government, right? We're going to see more hostility and less resources.
Perfect. Good, good, good. All right, you can go ahead and pop the battery in.
Green lights. You can hear me already? Okay.
Hi, welcome. We're going to start as close to on time as possible so that we can have as much time and respect the time of our guests this evening. So I am Father Nate Adishian. I'm the priest here at St. Paul's. And before we jump in, we'll pray at the end. So we'll spend some time doing that. But first, I wanted to draw attention to we want to do a little church history. So I'm going to read a passage from Justin Martyr. He's a 2nd century theologian. And what he's doing in his little book called The Apology is he's trying to give an account. He's not saying I'm sorry. He's saying, please, Roman Emperor, don't persecute us because we're like a lot of the other religions in the area. And so he gives an account of what worship is in the 2nd century. And I just want to read this one little passage of the first apology of Justin Martyr. After these services, we constantly remind each other of these things, those who have more to aid those who lack, and we are constantly together. Over all that we have received, we bless the Maker of all things through his Son, Jesus Christ, through the Holy Spirit. And on the day called Sunday, there is a meeting in one place of those who live in the cities and countries. And the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as the time permits. We don't do that in the Episcopal Church anymore, right? Then we stand up together and offer prayers. And as said before, when we have finished our prayers, bread is brought and wine and water, and the president, the priest, similarly sends up prayers and thanksgivings to the best of his ability, and the congregation assents, saying Amen. And distribution and reception of the consecrated elements of each one takes place, and they are sent to the absent, those who aren't able to make it, by the deacon. Here's the important part for tonight. Those who prosper and who wish contribute each one as much as they choose to. What is collected is deposited with the president, the priest, and he takes care of orphans and widows and those who are in want on account of sickness or any other cause, and those who are in bonds, and the strangers who are sojourners among us. And briefly, he is a protector of all those in need. I bring this up only to say that the care of those who are impoverished, those who are in need, is absolutely essential to the worship of the church. This is part of our heritage. It was the church that created the hospital as we know it. There was no place for people to go to get cared for by doctors and nurses. The church created that institution. And that's why Christianity grew so quickly in the early church, because there was this outpouring of love for those who were sick and needed it. So there is this desperate need, I think, for us to reimagine the church, but I mean because we need to go back to the way that we have cared for people in the past as an extension. It's in the context of the Eucharist. It's in the context of the Eucharist that we go out and we care for the needs of those who are in our communities. I am incredibly privileged to get you both in the same place on the same night. I had to schedule this. I wanted to make sure
It was really early.
4 or 5 months in advance to make sure I could get them on the same night. And even Connie said back then, it's like, dang, you plan ahead. Yes, I do. So let me introduce our speakers, our panel this evening. Connie Snyder-Mick is the Senior Associate Director of Academic Affairs and Director of Poverty Studies, interdisciplinary minor in the Institute for Social Concerns. This is hard for me because I was a postdoc from the Center of Social Concerns, but I guess it was a lesser postdoc.
No.
Oh, okay.
You made us what we are.
Oh, I see. She is the editor for the Journal of Poverty and Public Policy, and the publisher of 2 books. The first one, Poverty and Privilege, and the second, Good Writing, which actually has to do with poverty. Connie, I'm delighted to call my friend. I sat in on her Writing for Social Change course a year ago.
You were great.
And we read Poverty by America together in that class. And I knew when we read it together, I'm like, we need to read this as the church. Carl Hetler is a Methodist pastor, not currently in a church, but was at Broadway Christian Parish. You're from California.
Yep.
Where?
Berkeley.
Hey, Salinas. I don't think we knew this. All right. I used to go hang out on Telegraph. I was one of those shoeless, dreaded hippies that would sit out there on Telegraph outside of Berkeley. Yeah, right. Not so much anymore. Not so much. Why do you think it fell out? Because I didn't take care of it and I dreaded it. He is the poverty coordinator in South Bend, which you have been in that role since a year and a half. Was temporary role, but now it's made more permanent. Thank God.
Great.
So poverty coordinator, you don't coordinate impoverished people. You coordinate
Trying to get people out of poverty.
trying to get people out of poverty, right?
Especially housing.
Okay, good. And he has some information that he can draw from, and I can send out any of those documents later if you'd like to take a look at them. So with this, my first question is, I know you and I have read the Desmond book. I know that you've done it at least twice because you've done it once and then you did it with me.
Yeah.
Maybe a third time?
Oh, a lot. Yeah.
Oh, a lot. Okay,
Yeah,
she's read a lot. And I know that Carl has read it because you and I have done a long walk and we've talked about it. Can I get I'm taking you all as the experts in the room tonight. Can I get your opinion on what was so striking about this particular text and why it's been so important to you in your study of these and your activism in these things?
I'll start. Sure. So first, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation to talk about poverty. Not everyone wants to do that. It's one of those things we'd rather avoid, right? And we easily can if we're in privileged gated communities that are protected. We have a community where, a country where we are so often segregated in terms of what we have and the resources we have available to us. And so it takes effort, unfortunately, sometimes to really engage with folks who are in pain all around us, who experience poverty. So thank you for coming out tonight on a little warmer winter evening, but for taking the time to read the book. But it's good to have books like this, to have moments like this. That's why one of the messages from the class that we had together was that it's important to write and talk and communicate about hard things, even if we don't have all the answers, but to do that in an informed way. And this is a book like this is an occasion to gather, right? To have a common text where it's not just my experience and yours, but let's bring our experience to a well-researched text. So Desmond is a sociologist. I love to look at the back of books first. Who are you citing? Whose shoulders are you standing on? And it's really thick, that section of citations, right? So that makes me excited that this is somebody who's done the work for years and years and years, as well-researched. It's not just his opinions, but it's information based on years of research. So I think we often get a lot of stories about poverty. We get little snippets in the news or little snippets from our neighbors that are not that are not full. They don't represent the complexity of how poverty happens and why it persists in a world of plenty. So I think it's a book that really gets at that with, you've got data, right? But you also have stories. We talk in the class in poverty studies about the importance of stories and stats, right? We need hard data, we need facts, we need information. Are things getting better or worse? How do we know? What are those measures? But also who is experiencing poverty, who isn't, and why? Who are those people? We're rarely moved to take action unless we hear, firsthand stories and understand on a human level what that really means, develop empathy for things that we haven't experienced ourselves. So I think Desmond does kind of all that in this one book. Covers a lot of ground. Poverty covers housing and immigration, right? And gender issues, environmental issues, education, healthcare, incarceration, which is something I've worked on lately. All these things in one. And so it's a lot of ground to cover, but I think he does that efficiently. Gives you a little taste of the breadth of what we're talking about in terms of poverty, but also puts a face and a mind on that issue. So I think it's a great text that works for. So I've taught it with high school students. I've taught it at Notre Dame in the Introduction to Poverty Studies course and the senior capstone course, and I've taught it with men imprisoned out at Westville Correctional Facility. So I taught out there for the first time last spring. I took 11 Notre Dame students with me, and we had a course on poverty and justice out at Westville. So those men had a lot of experience with poverty. Incarceration is both, I think, a cause and a consequence. Or poverty is a cause and a consequence of incarceration, right? There's a deep connection there. And yet these men have had personal experience and yet didn't have language or a sense of some of the bigger picture, the system that perpetuates poverty, that keeps folks imprisoned or in pain, but in public still. So it's great to talk about it in churches as well, and with people of faith for whom, as you rightly say, this should be part of how we worship and how we act on what we believe. So that was a long answer, but I think it's been a useful text in a lot of ways.
I think two other things, and it's great to be here. Glad we have such a great opportunity to converse, and looking forward to hearing your questions and insights also that you can bring to the conversation. I think two other things that the book really does well is it challenges those of us who have benefited from an unjust system, whether it's educationally or in terms of wealth or where we grew up and lived, that we are challenged, I think, to recognize how the system is set up and maybe we've benefited from that. So there's some good challenges, but he does it in a way that's not condescending or judgmental, but just pointing out the reality of the system that we live in that many of us benefit from. And I think the second thing, this is what Nate and I got a chance to talk about on our walk, is what are ways that a local congregation like St. Paul's can actually get involved and address some of those systemic changes. And we'll get into some of those details. But I think there's some good ideas that Desmond gives us on some of the practical little avenues that he hits a lot of different topics, but that's helpful for us to break it down into different categories, whether it has to do with immigration or incarceration or banking or housing prices. He breaks it all down so we can think about maybe what's one piece that St. Paul's can do, and we can talk about Broadway as an example of a church that has picked one piece that they want to try to address, and there's other congregations doing that in different ways. And so I think it's also helpful that he gives us these different nuggets and categories so we don't get overwhelmed by the category of poverty, but we can see the different pieces of it and think about how can we as a collection of people, not just individuals, but as a collection, a group motivated by our faith and our religious beliefs, get involved and make a practical difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can you so let me follow up. Let me follow this. What is Broadway doing right now? What is the nugget that they're talking about right now?
So Broadway started back in the 70s with a food pantry because they saw the need in their community. And then they wanted to not only have an opportunity to give away food to help people that were in need, but they wanted to create that community among their neighbors. So they started after their Sunday worship of gathering downstairs for a community meal. And that was an opportunity for the people who came in from out of the neighborhood or used to live in the neighborhood to sit down and have a meal with people in that neighborhood who were struggling. And out of that, they saw that there was a need for more than a meal just once a week, but that they started doing a breakfast for 4 mornings a week. And then it became a hot breakfast. And now we've added showers and laundry and advocacy and clothing, all that's available to help people who are on the streets, who are in shelters, or even marginally housed and employed, but still struggling. And that was deepened by their AIDS ministries in the 80s. They were one of the first congregations in Michiana to openly welcome people who either had HIV/AIDS or were caring for those who had HIV/AIDS when that was very a hot button topic that many churches didn't want to get involved in. And then also to be able to continue to center that around the Eucharist also, and to do a weekly communion there, which is very unusual for United Methodist churches, because that was so central to God's offer of hospitality to all of us, and that was motivating all of their ministry outreaches, was that same hospitality that Jesus offers us, his body and his blood. They wanted to extend to people in ways that was nourishing and life-giving to them, and that need to have that communion centered in how they were doing that and the radical hospitality that they practiced.
Connie, can you speak to bringing it back to Desmond? Because you've read it enough times, I'm sure you can draw upon a particular story or person. Oh, let me see. Sorry, let me do it in this. A particular story or person that Desmond gave an account of that struck you or taught you something or opened your eyes to something.
Sure.
I have my answer, but I'm interested to know what yours
Might be the
is.
same one. The story of Julio is the one that stays with me, right? He's the man who's working 2 or 3 jobs, right? Minimum wage or not much more than that. Absolutely exhausted. And his little brother tells him that he's been saving up his money. And Julio says, for what? He said, well, how much would it cost to buy an hour of your time, right? And little brother just wants big brother's time. And Julio, he's working and passes out from exhaustion, right? And it's never going to change. He recognizes I cannot live like this. This is that desperation, that despair that happens when you're giving your all and you just know you're doing the math and it is never going to work in your favor. You're going to be stuck in that. And you can understand why people do some desperate things sometimes, right? How do I get ahead in some way and get out of this? But my students, that particular story stands out with them and to me as well. Children see that injustice, right? And in this case, this young child wants to buy into the only system he sees around. You have to pay for people and find out what they're worth, right, in an hourly rate. Oh my goodness, right? The child sees that. Mm-hmm. Was there one that stood out to you?
The same. We talked about that one when we met a few months ago also, that was heart-wrenching. Before we jump into a discussion particularly of the church's role in our local community, I want to ask you a broad Desmond question. And it's a little bit of a devil's advocate question. I'm going to be playing the other side just for a moment. For most of the book, he seems to be saying the system is a leaky bucket, mm-hmm. right? But way over in page 131, he writes, we should go big. No more nudges, no more tinkering, no more unfunding an initiative and then asking why it didn't work. Ambitious interventions should be funded by progressive tax policies and a redesignation of welfare state and delivering in ways that do not sow division among struggling families who should, for all intent and purposes, be political allies. So it seems like he's saying we should be pouring more into a leaky bucket. Can you respond to that?
Me first?
Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I think it's a both and. We need to spend more, but on the right things, I think, is his general argument, that some of what we're spending on isn't returning or hasn't kept up with the times or evolved in ways. So it's both going to take more. We do have to pay, we do have to right the ship. It's going to take some resources and some energy. So I think he's not naive about that. But I think also makes a case that some of the things we need to figure out what is and isn't working. And there's been some stasis of, programs that have been around forever, stay, right? And aren't always evaluated to see if they're what's needed. So I think it's a little bit of both. Okay. We can't get out without spending something.
Right. So like practical examples would be like the earned income tax credit for children is something that is shown to have a huge impact to help lift children out of poverty and provide for families. And that when we increase that amount that's beneficial for families across the board. We saw a similar thing during the pandemic with a lot of the federal funding that helped lower the poverty level and care for people. That when we make these big ambitious investments, especially when they're cash transfers as opposed to some of the block grants that he talks about, like TANF, for example, but just big cash transfers, trusting that people will know where to spend the money and we can trust them with that makes a difference in the numbers of poverty. I think specifically looking at housing, we can look at veterans, for example, and the emphasis that we have to have functional zero to make sure that all veterans have an option for whether it's a shelter at a place like Miller's Vets, at Center for the Homeless, or services through the VA at the Walorski Clinic, or other options that we have for supportive housing for veterans, that we are putting a lot of money to people who have deserve it, who have served our country and sacrificed for it. But we show that when we give that ambitious amount of money, we can solve that problem. We can provide housing for all of our veterans who are in need and do that. So I think we see that ambitious big dollar amounts does make a difference when we do that. I do think that Desmond has a point, though, that we have to acknowledge the ways that our system is broken, right? That simply putting in more money in a minimum wage job isn't going to be able to buy you time with family or even buy you safe habitation in a lot of our communities, especially in Michiana. So I think there is a good challenge there that we have to look at. The system is broken, and I would project that we're going to see more breaking over the next 4 years, that there's going to be less federal investment, that there is going to be more of heartache and crisis for people in need. And there is the potential that the system could break because enough people are going to be disadvantaged and not want to take it anymore, that the small drips into that leaky bucket as they get cut off, that people are going to become more upset and want to see drastic change.
Yeah. Can I ask him sort of a more philosophical question? In the debates for these kinds of things, either in small churches like this or even at the level of Congress, is the way that we talk about these kinds of things not helpful? And what I mean by that is there was a time, I think, being a historian of the 20th century, there was a time when we used to think about government policies in terms of what is good and what is right. Whereas now it's more of a discussion of what's expedient, what can we afford, and it seems like even the language that we've started to use in order to discuss some of these things has altered so much to be what is good for us, what is good for me, rather than what is the good thing and the right thing. Can you speak to that?
Desmond, he's quoting someone else, but he talks about, if we need a better boat for the sea, it's not just about dismantling the boat, building a better boat, but teaching people to long for the sea, long for the journey, like to think bigger, right? So it's not just about this what's in front of us, but how do you change our sense of purpose and destination? So yeah, I think some of that's lost. I mean, what you read here, this is what religious communities are supposed to be about, but there are few people, actively involved in religious communities, right? So I think we've lost some attention and some energy from that arena to sort of guide, and politicians are supposed to represent us, but I think we've lost some of that moral compass from the people in terms of activism on the local level and influencing our public leaders as well. So I think that's one of the problems, that's more societal in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, we can think about it on two different dimensions, right? We all live within a capitalistic society, right, where it takes money to keep a building like this lit and warm and keep Nate paid, right? That takes an investment, right? That we have a functional capitalism system that we're a part of here, that we live in, and that we're encouraging people to find jobs, even if they're minimum wage. We're encouraging people when they are returning citizens to find places to live and ways to get involved in that system. But I think as people of faith, we can think about a different dimension of communal living, where people's worth isn't based on how much you make, what you can offer, but there is still especially a one anothering of how do we love one another, care for one another, equip one another, that we can live at a different higher level, a different plane, where we are interacting, trying to avoid and get away from that capitalistic mentality of what do you have to provide, what is this going to cost me, to really be communal. And I think it's important for us to recognize that philosophical difference and to recognize what are the times when we have to be in that capitalistic sphere to keep the lights and heat on and to keep the pastor showing up. But what are the ways that we can create the community of Christ, that beloved community that really, I think, this would be the place that Desmond doesn't really address, like the idea of hope and faith, that is there a benevolent being out there that's actively working to infuse our world with grace and kindness and love and mercy that we can be a part of, that we can tap into, that is beyond simply dollar amounts that we can give, and that we can create a community where people are loved and respected and cherished and able to give from their gifts also to give back to one another, so it truly is a two-way community that is communal and not just capitalistic exchange.
I think Desmond calls it commoning. Kind of later in the book when he talks things like reimagining how we can live in spaces together, commoning rather than something else. I forget the exact term.
I can't remember the name of her book, but she's got a New York Times article that talks about the art of dependence, right? Of fostering that in people. There's such a narrative of independence and capitalism is, the individual striving and achieving alone, right? But she talks about embracing that we all need each other, right? And then it's good to need others as well. And that's an art that we've lost perhaps and need to develop.
And I think especially for those of us, assume the majority of this group, that we are educated, that we, when we pray, give us today our daily bread, we knew where our next meal was coming from. We probably have enough bread for tomorrow also stored up for us. And one of the things that I've tried to do at Broadway and other congregations I've served at also is recognize that need for that two-way relationship, that we need people who are experiencing poverty to teach us about real faith, about what it means to pray the Lord's Prayer and really mean it and depend upon it, that we shouldn't come with the sense that like I have wealth or education and means and so I'm going to give to you out of my abundance, but more that I'm poor in my faith, in my spiritual practices, and I need to learn from you. What's it like to walk with faith, to hoping the soup kitchen will be open? What is it like to pray for the food to be provided and not sure what you're going to eat that day? And so to really create that two-way opportunity for us to learn from others and to see the value that people who are experiencing poverty have lots to teach us who maybe have material wealth. We have much to learn and benefit from in our own spiritual poverty that we need to learn and grow from.
Yeah. My congregation is probably sick of me saying this, but the historical meaning of charity is not the one-way giving of money. It's the two-way giving of love in relationship with others. And so we've kind of lost the meaning of charity when we think of it in terms of I'm going to give out of my abundance to someone else who I perceive is in need, without thinking that they might actually have something to assist in my own poverty, which might be a spiritual poverty. So we've lost that meaning of charity. I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up. And this is the big one, and maybe we can kind of delve in deeper, and you've already touched on it a little bit. But what are on the one hand, what is the role of the church in the 21st century to fill in the needs of any particular community, but specifically this community? What can small congregations do to be Christ in the world in this respect?
Yeah. I'm from a different small congregation. I'm at Prince of Peace Church of the Brethren up on Ironwood and Cleveland Road there. We're small overall, and our congregation, as a denomination, but a small congregation as well. Our, I think, most active recent ministry is working with refugee families through the URC, the United Religious Communities. Folks don't leave their home for no reason. They are driven by poverty and despair and lack of opportunity. And boy, the journeys they make to come here are just unfathomable. And they get here and it's still a journey, right? They come with nothing, and they need language, and they need driving, and they need food and housing, and they get substandard housing, and everything. It's even when you have systems of help in place, it's still a real challenge. So that's been really powerful, as you described. That's been good for our congregation to have that experience with this family, We aren't a super wealthy congregation, but we're fine and we're stable, and we have enough. You recognize how much extra you have, right, when you see folks with so little. So that's been really powerful for us. No congregation can do all the things. No individual can do all of them. You find your passion and your intersection in those opportunities. You know, if we all did some of that, you know, it would be powerful, but we have to coordinate it as well.
If only
you
we
know,
had a coordinator who could do that.
it's really, really hard, isn't it? You know, to even know what folks are doing. In a generous community like this, there's a lot of initiatives. So, you know, making sure that everybody's covered is really important. So that's, I mean, I'm glad it's a position now, but a newer position, right? And we've needed that for a long time. So I think that's incredibly helpful. But it has to be in concert with federal programs. And I mean, the power and the of a you know, federal policy is really remarkably powerful. I mean, we saw that during COVID, as you mentioned, you know, when the middle class started to get, you know, touched by the economic downturn, it was, you know, things happened quickly to respond. So yeah, I mean, how do we keep that sense of urgency all the time? And I think it's, again, by putting a face on it, getting to know families who are, you know, refugees or others who are, you know, who are hungry, who are houseless, and getting to know them on a personal level. And I think congregations can do that well.
I've joked with one of our parishioners, without really joking, that we should do a paperwork ministry because sometimes the paperwork for Medicare, Medicaid is so complicated.
It's
one woman
intentionally so. I mean,
intentionally so. So I've joked with a woman, like, we should just do a paperwork ministry where people can bring the paperwork for these kinds of programs and just do them. It's incredibly not interesting work, but so essential.
Yeah.
There's definitely that place for that coordination, and I'm glad to have that opportunity, and especially coming from a church background, to be able to help connect lots of churches to know what each other is doing, so that you talk about paperwork, I think immediately of who are the agencies I know of who are doing that. And there's some nonprofits out there that are trying to help people get on Medicaid and do that kind of paperwork, or qualify for disability is another huge one for people who've been chronically homeless. I think about the different churches that are doing outreach on the streets and trying to help them coordinate what they're doing in the different pieces also. And then all the other services that happen, whether it's meal sites or shelter sites or support services for mental health or substance use, helping coordinate all the services and helping churches that are interested get plugged in with the different agencies of what's already going on. So that's definitely, I think, definitely a part of it, of what I'm trying to do. And there's steps I talk about when I do presentations at churches and other groups. I talk about that first step of just donating, whether it's financially to help out an existing agency or program, something like the URC, donating clothing to a clothing place, secondhand clothing, donating food to a food pantry. We have 37 food pantries across St. Joseph County. And so there's lots of opportunities to donate and just give out of our abundance to what we have to help others. That's that first step. And the second step is really to start volunteering somewhere, to actually choose a place where you actually want to show up, and maybe it's behind the scenes, stocking shelves, or helping out with paperwork at an agency, but maybe it's getting to know people and serving people face to face in a program, whether it's at a meal line, whether it's at another service agency, but getting to know people as you volunteer in a location. But the third step, and this is really the challenge that we're just now starting to address more, is that relationship of getting to know someone. We have enough faith groups and other people of goodwill that if everyone helped one person who is struggling, if every group of us helped just one person who's struggling, we could help everyone who is struggling in our community. We could help them find housing, get mental health resources, find occupations. There's that possibility of doing that if we just would get to know one person, walk alongside of them in that long-term journey. We're talking 3 to 5 years is what it takes for someone. The neurochemistry of addiction says that's how long it takes to rewire your brain from substances that have been harmful. It takes that long for someone to break some of the habits and patterns that have gotten to them of a place of chronic need. And so I talked about those different steps in helping people just take that next step up, whatever it may be, wherever you're at, to go to donating or to go to volunteering or to go to building a relationship. I think about some examples of different churches I've served in. Evangel Heights is another United Methodist congregation in South Bend that has a preschool program, and they intentionally set aside some of their spots for families that are low income so that they can be able to give them affordable daycare for when they're going to work. Maybe at McDonald's, there's still daycare available for them that they wouldn't be able to afford otherwise, that's safe and humane, and they allow the other families to help subsidize that. And that's one way that they serve families that are struggling in our community. Or I think of Stone's Church down by Miami Hills Village, a place that has lots of housing problems, lots of crime and violence and negligent landlords. They're committed, because they're so close, to investing in that community, to building relationships and doing service projects there because it's so close to them. I think about where you're at here at St. Paul's. Does anyone know what's going in the old City Hall here that's across the street?
Yeah,
Boys and Girls Club, and what else? United Way, right? The new United Way One Roof Center is going to be going in there. So not just Boys and Girls Club, but lots of other agencies are going to be there. And so you have this great opportunity with people that are going to be coming into your neighborhood because they need services, they need to connect with providers, and you've got a great opportunity to think about one of many different ways that you might be able to help connect with people who are in need because of what the United Way and Mishawaka City are doing here to serve people who are in need in your community. And so there's great opportunities, and I think this can be a Kairos moment for us to think about what God is doing and the opportunities that we have as things align between government and other nonprofits, for you all here to think about what role God might have in what is going forward. You have a beautiful river walk that has been developing, right? And lots of great opportunities. But there's unhoused people sleeping in Central Park, not necessarily when it's cold, but they're there. They're down Lincoln Way at Capitol behind all the fast food restaurants. They're not too far from here, sleeping down there. And we know in other parts, like up by UP Mall and at the old Kroger in Merrifield, there's people sleeping outside tenting also. And so we know there's extreme need around here. And so while we invest in beautiful things and a nice river walk, we also know there's a lot of tragedy and a lot of chronic need that maybe we have the opportunity to help do one small piece again. Don't have to solve it all here at St. Paul's, but maybe there's one piece of what Desmond talks about and the issues of poverty that God may be calling you all to get involved in.
Yeah. We had we'll just call them a public official, come by our church with a bunch of others in order to give us an assessment on how best to use our building for the community, sacred spaces that we've done recently. And this public official totally missed the point of us getting together to think about our building. It's like, your property value is going to go up because of this and this. And I'm like, boy, you sure missed the point. We'll just leave it at that. But he's like, yeah, United Way. And then the Women's Center across the street, like, you guys are going to be a great space for your tax something. I'm like, yeah, you don't care. So I'm going to open it up for questions. There are people who are watching online. If you have a question and you're not here, please email it to me at stpauls.mishawaka@gmail.com. And I'll open it up to everyone here, but I have a question already in my inbox, if I will. Going great. Would be curious on the panel's take on what, if anything, characterizes poverty in our area versus the national picture Desmond is painting. Are there particular aspects of local poverty that are a product of our local geography, history, economy, or is it essentially a generic Rust Belt story? What is missing from Desmond's picture to fill out our understanding?
Good question. Do you want?
I'll start with that. So I think one of the trade-offs with Notre Dame is we have amazing academics like Dr. Mick, who's here to share her knowledge and do a lot of great research and bring students into places like Westville to impact people and help them get education. But one of the trade-offs, the New York Times highlighted Notre Dame on a national trend of rising rent costs and the prevalence of Airbnbs for people who want to go to a football game. There's going to to be another one in less than 2 weeks, and I'm sure all the Airbnbs will be full for that also. But the reality of that and that pressure that Notre Dame is a wonderful institution and a great football school creates is there's less housing stock for rent because people can make as much money doing a couple football weekends as they can to having a year-round renter. So that's one of the unique challenges I think that we have with other big college towns. New York Times highlighted Alabama and Missouri as two other schools similar to Notre Dame where that takes place. And so I think that's one of the trade-offs that we have to think about is that economic pressure for people to cater to Notre Dame alums and fans and how that impacts the people's ability to find places to rent that are available in our community.
No, I think that's exactly right. That's a problem, and it's a trend in other universities, but it's definitely a problem with housing. It's also a problem that we have students come in, get this wonderful education, and then go out, right? They often don't stay here. There's an opportunity to entice folks to stick around, and I think people have been saying that for a while. So while it's a problem, it could be an opportunity as well to keep folks here and to continue people with a conscience to develop for them to take these kinds of classes, to be leaders and employers who think about poverty in what they do. That's what we want. It's maybe a drop in the bucket, but hopefully there's opportunity in that pipeline as well. The folks who are going to come back with their religious formation and hopefully stick around and practice some of that. There's examples of that, Margie File, other folks in the community who are really making a difference. But I think we need more folks like that who stay and lead.
Can you, Margie File is...
She helped co-found the Catholic Worker in town. She's a theologian, so she works at the Institute for Social Concerns and in theology as well, teaches wonderful engaged courses on sustainability and helped, was part of the impetus behind the Motels for Now and the New Day Intake Center. So just somebody who both teaches and practices how to do this work. It's not just theory, it's life, how to live that lifestyle. She's a wonderful model for folks.
And that's what I was going to mention is that's another positive influence I think that is unique to South Bend is that Catholic social teaching and principles of solidarity with the poor and preference for the poor that is being practiced throughout our city, not only at the Catholic Worker that provides housing for people, at Our Lady of the Road that provides meals, Our Lady of Rosary that provides medical care, Motels for Now that's been around for 4.5 years, has served over 800 people, just celebrated their 250th person that have helped get permanent housing as a result of coming through that motel out by the airport. And so there has been not only this ethos and this vision and this implementation, but then also bringing the faculty and students to help serve in all these places, to live in community, to serve meals, to staff out at the motels. And so that's been one of the other unique things I think that has been here in South Bend on the positive side that has shaped us and encouraged us across the religious spectrum.
Can I on the question that was just asked, can I drill down a little bit further and say, from both of your knowledge of this area, what historically has been the cause? We have the Rust Belt narrative.
We do, yeah.
But what historically has been the sort of cause of a lot of the poverty in this particular area?
I mean, it is a Rust Belt narrative with the Studebaker factory closing down in the 60s, right? And just never having a replacement employer that was on the scale that was. I mean, the decline of unions, right? So Notre Dame was, maybe still is, the largest employer in town. So that's not ideal if, and a lot of the folks in the higher paid positions come from out of town to work at Notre Dame. And there are a lot of on-call positions, right, where you don't have full-time employment at Notre Dame. They're working service jobs and kind of the service industry there, connected to athletics and different things. So there's jobs, but not well-paying jobs, very unstable jobs. So when the whole community is kind of looking to that sort of employment, that's a challenge, I think. It's part of it.
I'd say in addition, as many other northern cities, we had redlining where if you're African American, you could only buy housing in certain areas with more distressed properties, and you had less equity that's been built up over the past generations. And so we're still seeing the impacts of that. We live in a state that the legislature is trying to dismantle public education. And so we see less funding and more alternative sources of vouchers and charter schools that are being funded also. And Desmond talks about how education is such a key part to being able to break out of poverty and move into other levels of income, and what a big difference that is. And then I think also specifically here in South Bend, we have to acknowledge that there's been a Democrat stranglehold in that city also. And so if you want to be balanced in that view, you have to acknowledge that there has probably been party favoritism, and one party rule is never beneficial in terms of a competition of ideas and marketplace and growth. And so I think we have to acknowledge that creates challenges also to really be able to break beyond party favoritism and backroom deals to really involve everyone and benefit the whole community.
In Mishawaka too. Yeah, Mishawaka too. Anyone from here have a question? Want to follow up with anything? My inbox is blowing up, so we have other questions. But anyone else? Does anyone want to ask anything here? Yeah.
Please. I was in one of the United Awards many years back, and we had a program called Bridges Over Poverty. Yes. Is it still in existence?
It is.
Sorry. Can you repeat the question?
So the question is about Bridges Out of Poverty, which has gone through some different locations. It was at Monroe Circle Community Center for a while. It was at Goodwill. It's currently being run out of YWCA right now. And what they're doing is sort of a creative new model that's 2 generations. So mostly women, the parents are going through the Bridges Out of Poverty material from Ruby Payne, but they're also having the kids go through it since it's a shelter that provides housing for families. And so their hope is that by addressing it at both levels, for the parents and for the kids, they can try to break some of that cycle of poverty. And the hope is to be able to now expand it after this school year to schools like Measle have been shown interest in South Bend within doing the same thing, providing that for parents and also for the students in there. So they're still reworking it. Leroy King is a trained facilitator in that, and we're hoping to be able to expand this new 2-generation model.
Any other questions here in the room?
I'm smiling because I did interviews out at Westville for men to be in the spring class, and I got writing samples before they came in, and one seemed very, aligned with the Bridges Out of Poverty sort of framework. And he spoke very well to it. He was very prepared for the interview. And as he left, I saw him drop off his book. He had checked out a book, Ruby Payne's book, from the library in the Westville Correctional Facility. And so he'd been studying up using that framework there. So just interesting.
He has a long time ago.
Yeah.
And Connie was a fabulous program. But what happened was I was on there when we had that big time, 2006. So it became very difficult for these people who are going out to college because of those degrees. And I do have even one person that I've known all these years who excelled from being an AD, have a great job now and managing facility and everything else. But it seemed to me that when Desmond talks about you make a little bit too much money,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
that you got
Yeah.
behind me.
Yeah, it's real. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I could have done more, and then
Yeah.
It's gone. Yeah.
I need to try to figure out.
Yeah. You as an individual cannot change that. That's outside of your control.
Yeah. So I have. Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I belong to a book club, and I try to talk to these women about this book and also about White Poverty by William Barber.
Yeah.
And these women cannot get it. It's like they blame the poor for being poor.
Yeah.
Yep.
And why aren't they getting jobs? And some mothers are trying to tell their daughters to have more children so they'll get more welfare. And they stay on that. And also that the poor should be happy with anything that we get done.
Mm-hmm.
And, I felt so, I was irritated, I was upset, I was angry,
Yeah.
and I couldn't get through to them that, we are part of all of this,
Yeah.
We have to do something about it to help one another. They were not budging. And finally, I just said, we can't talk about this anymore because you're not getting it and I'm getting really
It's
upset.
hard. Yeah.
And how do you deal with people like that?
Yeah.
How do we educate?
Yeah. So let me rephrase the question in the mic so people can hear the question and make sure we understand. Yeah. How do you? The question is, how do you deal with these women? The question is, make sure we're understanding you correctly, is when you're having conversation with other people who seem to have these narratives of it's self-imposed or have more children to get more money from the government or to like these kinds of assumptions about poverty, and they're unwilling to read things like Desmond and like some other things. How do you have conversations? How do you not only have conversations with them, but then also kind of convince them and argue your case? That's the question on the table.
So I'd say pastorally, what I would do is following that donate volunteer relationship strategy that we'd have people at Broadway, for example, who would drop off clothing, were well-to-do, or drop off food, and that was great. They were willing to do that, and then to invite them to take that next step. So I might say to women, for example, or anyone who's resistant, is like, well, let's pick an organization that we want to donate to. You know, who do you think is a worthy cause that we can give, even if it's our secondhand things, even if they don't deserve it, we want to donate to people and build a relationship that way with an agency. So you can take that next step eventually over time, say, let's go and volunteer, maybe behind the scenes, maybe actually do something with this agency that we've been going to, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk to someone and hear their story and maybe hear some of the adverse childhood experiences. ACEs are one of the things that help us understand, for many people who are struggling today, it's not just an unjust system, but it's the harm that was done to them as children has caused them to find dysfunctional ways to deal with that, whether that's through substance use or mental health impact or just other challenges that they're facing. It often traces back to problems they had as a child that were not their responsibility at all. And so when you hear someone's story, when you sit down with them and understand that, that's one way to break through some of that myopia, some of that indifference, that ignorance. But it takes some of those steps of slowly building that relationship and connection.
I did something that.
Yeah.
The one lady said, I'd rather know pets. The pets?
Yeah.
Pets.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm in 3. You can come my way.
Connie, do you have any statement on the pets?
On the pets. Pets are.
No, just kidding. But to the
No.
broader question of narratives and like that kind of thing.
I mean, this is a question of empathy. How do you build empathy in people who've had one kind of world experience, a very sheltered, perhaps in some ways? There's so many narratives about the poor, right, out in the world, and they're entrenched, and you hear them so often that they feel true, right? You know, they're reinforced in movies and fiction and these snapshots of little, snippets of information in public discourse. So it takes a while to unlearn things before you can relearn, and relearning is most powerful when it's human. I mean, those are the right strategies to get to know folks. I probably have an easier time because people come, like you all, you chose to read this book. I teach courses that people choose to take, right? So there's something a little cracked open in them already to be open to this. But they still grow and learn, through what we read and through the people. My courses are always very engaged with talking to the people directly, not me talking on their behalf. Last week, we had 2 formerly incarcerated men come into my class at Notre Dame, talk about their experience of reentry. One had his ankle bracelet on that he pays for, that he paid to have installed and pays a monthly fee for. Like hearing those stories from the people who are experiencing themselves. He's working at a bakery out in Elkhart, but the pay, he can barely afford to just pay for his own, the criminal costs, he's never going to get ahead, right? The desperation you hear from him just in this space, my students wouldn't be exposed to any other way, right? So there's but these are high touch, the investments, right? It takes a while to do this kind of work sometimes, or having the right opportunity to have, a course that you're going to get that kind of exposure, to have a place like Notre Dame that allows me to do that kind of teaching is pretty exceptional. But I'm glad to influence these students. They often talk about talking with their family members at Thanksgiving and other time who may be more resistant, more like the person you've talked about, right? But they have a relationship with that person, and that helps, kind of crack things open a little bit as well.
The other thing can be if, poverty by America is too dense and challenging, is to do fiction about homelessness. So we have a local author, Kate Higgins, I think is her name, who wrote the book Junkyard Dogs, about the actual real case of homeless men who were murdered and stuffed down a manhole. And so Junkyard Dogs tells a fictional account of that. And so that is another thing that has scientifically been shown to build empathy, is when you read fictional accounts that connect with people.
My question was basically the same thing, but with regards to film. If books are too much time, too much effort, are there any particularly good films that you both would suggest?
Well, my girls and I just saw Wicked. But that's a core question. Are we born a particular way, right? And how does the world shape the narrative about who we are? Are there good people and bad people? Or I love that this unpacks that, goes back a step, which is what ACE's Adverse Childhood Experiences is all about, right? Well, what was your childhood like? Don't just look at the adult in front of you. Think of that person's childhood. I was so struck by, at Westville, how often I wasn't asking the men to write about their childhood, but they did. They kept going back to that and talking about those those traumatic experiences they had as a child. And so anyway, that's being a little funny with that, but it's out there, and there's lots of great documentaries as well. Brian Stevenson's work on incarceration is phenomenal. Yeah.
I was going to add just popular culture. Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith is a great one. And then Street Stories is a retelling of the Charlie Chaplin silent film that deals with people on the street. And that's a modern retelling. Street Stories is really good. Another example.
Okay.
The Florida Project is a very intense film, but it's fiction looking at folks who kind of live in the hotels around Disney World and in the service, various kinds of service industries there. Again, it's intense, but that's poverty. You have to kind of be ready to take on some of those things.
Yeah. This question is directed to Connie, but I'll ask it of you both. What's your take on the possible legislation that would limit the credit card penalties on carrying a balance on a cap on late fees? I thought this sounded like a great idea until I heard a story on NPR that pointed out that the credit card companies may stop issuing cards to risky people who have poor credit. This could cause people who would normally use credit card. Yeah,
there's always a catch, right? Businesses do things that are good for them. So yeah, we need alternatives, right? We need, it's a nonprofit, but it's a student-run nonprofit at Notre Dame called Jiffy, the Jubilee Initiative for Financial Inclusion. Super tiny, but they do alternative lending to folks who are low income and probably high risk. A tiny space just to help folks not have to go to payday lenders or go to some of these extortive kinds of financial institutions. It's a tiny drop in the bucket, but there's some alternatives to that. Again, I trust big business to do what's best for big business, but we might not be able to change them, but are there alternatives? Are there community financial institutions and such that can kind of step in and be financial caretakers for folks in that space? I know locally we had such a problem with getting loans for some of the lower priced housing that's available, that was anyway, in the near Northwest neighborhood and some other neighborhoods that are still more affordable in the area, but there was a problem around 2008, 9. Banks weren't giving out loans that were so low. Like you might only need $50,000 or something to buy a home in one of those neighborhoods, but it wasn't in the bank's best interests to give out a loan because it costs them the same to manage a $250,000 loan versus a $50,000 loan. So they're like, why would we do that? It wasn't, wasn't in their interest. But local activists, Judy Fox and others from the Legal Aid Clinic at Notre Dame really explained the situation and went out and found some other banks that sort of changed their practices and were willing to serve that. So, conversations can change some of those kind of big corporate decision making, again, putting a face on it and saying, you're not going to lose that much by, catering to a population that's just underserved, right? Which forces people to rent instead of buy because they can't take out the mortgage. They might pay even more in rent than they are in investing in a home that they could own at some point, fully outright. So, yeah, it's always got to look at the fine print.
So another organization we have locally is Credit Friendly, CDFI, with Sam Centellis. They're doing some of that small margin loans where you can get a loan for like a car for $40,000, right? But you can't get one for a house for that amount. So they're trying to fill in that gap and do that creatively and find ways that you can fund that. Especially if you think about now doing more duplexes, if you could get the mortgage so that you could live on half the duplex and then be able to rent out the other half, that takes a little creative financing to think about how you work that to show the income stream. But that's something CDFI is working on to try to help find other flexible ways to get people funding. And the other thing I would say is, to imagine what it would look like for a church, a group to be able to provide some of those payday loans without being burdensome, charging an interest rate of like 8 to 10% in case of default, but being able to hold someone's paycheck, give them a paycheck advance without gouging them, that Desmond talks about in the book. There's an opportunity for a church that has a financial means or has that passion to be able to help address that need locally.
Yeah, I think St. Paul's we're actually starting to look at how to do that now. Because I have so many in my inbox, I'm going to go one more in my inbox. So this is actually, this feels like a Carl question, but I'll ask it to both of you, and it wraps in sort of the healthcare piece. Is there a way or organization that helps out with a family that just found out their loved one has dementia? Assuming that the family can't pay for certain kinds of care.
Right, so Real Services would be like the first place that I would start for people who are elderly experiencing dementia. Logan Center is another resource for people with intellectual disabilities to be able to get resources and support also. And then Oaklawn, which is our community health provider, starting January 1st, is getting a new federal program. Only 13 states were picked. Indiana was one of them. Oaklawn was one of 8 statewide agencies that was picked to get this additional federal funding. So they're no longer having to bill per person per service to Medicaid, but now just do general billing per day, is really unlocking the ability to provide more services. And so if maybe you've heard about the crisis center that's over on the east bank of South Bend that is open 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and the mobile team that's available to go out to people who are in crisis. Starting January 1st, that will be 24/7, that there will be a place for people to go. There will be people who can go to someone who's in need, and they will continue to have what they currently offer, a 24/7 phone number for people who are in crisis. So I'd recommend that as one option for people who are not just dealing with someone suffering dementia, but the mental health stress it is for the caregivers to also deal with that also can be burdensome. And Oaklawn is one of many mental health organizations we have that are equipped to help care for people and support them in the care that they're giving.
I just have personal experience caring for my mom for 10 and a half years, but I'm up over the border in Michigan, and the Council on Aging was incredibly helpful.
Okay.
But you find that, your county or where you live, we always talk about place matters in poverty studies. We happen to be in a very well-funded, council that had great services, but it really varies where you are, and you don't necessarily know that, what's available in your community.
The Michigan side was really well-funded?
Cass County was.
Cass County, okay.
Was particular. Somebody's a good grant writer, right, in that particular area suddenly.
Any good grant
lots
writers?
of services, so that's the
Anyone at home a
unevenness
good
of
grant
it.
writer?
Yeah.
Any in the room questions? Yeah.
I have a little bit of a comment, a little bit of a question. So I grew up probably in extreme poverty, so I could come and talk to your book club. But I think a lot about what Carl was talking about. Like I always think, like, how did I get to where I'm at? And when I reflect on it, a lot is through relationship. when I was a young adult, teenager, and in my early 20s. And education. Like, those were the big things. And so when I think about the church and how the church can show up, I think a lot about relationship and how we can build better relationships and not other each other so much.
Yeah.
So, but that kind of segues into, now I've been in healthcare for like 25 years. And talking about a system that needs some help.
Yeah.
Especially around serving people in poverty. It is really a challenge. So I'd love to see and hear what you guys think about, like, how as a society we can improve that, maybe as a faith community. I think about work I've done overseas, where I can show up in healthcare and serve the poor much more easily and readily than I could in our society. But I know there are other organizations out there that are actually trying to improve. Because when you go back to the ACEs stuff, the ACEs really was like, when people that have high ACEs scores typically have really poor health outcomes and a lot of complications. And you can't even be healthy enough to get to work and get a job, right? Which is what people want to say is the cure for poverty, right? Which is not true. There's so many barriers. Like, how do we even improve healthcare in our country in order to take care of everybody, not just the people that have the resources to do that. So, yeah, there you go.
It's foundational.
So the question is, how do we optimize healthcare for people who are in need? And
And as a faith community too, I think of like systems, like we're not a system.
right, the role for the faith community in healthcare. Let me start with just in general. Again, this is something that Notre Dame has helped with. The Lucy Institute ran data for us on ER visits, and because that is something the county pays for, ER and jail visits. We now have good data that shows that by housing people, doing a housing first model with motels for now, that we've been able to significantly decrease the number of ER visits and the length of visits and the seriousness of visits by housing people first. And so by housing people, we've been able to address some of the healthcare needs and decrease the costs, so that for those who don't care about people and just the bottom line, we can still show it's in your best interest to do proactive preventative models like housing. I think when it comes to the faith community and healthcare, there is a real challenge, especially because with the pandemic having been so politicized. I think that we have a real challenge in general to embrace healthcare, and I think we're going to see this challenge in the coming years also, that there will be a division politically and theologically about how much we embrace healthcare and what is valuable and reputable healthcare when it comes to things like vaccines, for example, or recognizing that minority populations have greater health disparities. Indiana is one of the worst places if you're an African-American woman to have a child. Your mortality rate is higher than much other rest of the country. And so I think those are definitely challenges, and it's not going to be easy in our faith communities either to bridge that. So that's a great question. I don't have an easy answer to that.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question, right? And preventative work is always less expensive and provides more dignity, is more human than waiting for people to fail, waiting for them to get hurt, waiting for them to get sick, right? So I would think a faith community can help make that argument, both from a sort of logical common sense, but also from a position of love and care for others. Having a toxic environment where kids are, that connection between our physical, as you mentioned, our physical well-being and our emotional well-being are so interconnected, right? That if you live in an unstable environment, whether it's your household and or your broader community, that has an impact on you that can have lifelong effects, right? And it's important to say those adversities from childhood can add up to really give us, diabetes and other kinds of heart conditions, all kinds of negative physical health outcomes. But there's also the other side, and maybe the church also needs to focus on that. It's not just those negatives. We can't always prevent harm. That's the ideal, right? We also need to build up the positive, right? And create care and alternatives to the negative, right? Where we can't, we need the both and of disrupting the negative, but also building the positive. And I think that the church can do that. After school programs, as you mentioned, attending to childcare, those kinds of things the churches can be very good at, just providing some stability where a community whether it's stability of food or just loving. People need at least 2 caring, competent adults in their life. It doesn't have to be your biological parents. That's great if that's the case, but it can be other people who step in and provide that sense of well-being to others. So, and that has physical health impacts as well, right? That mind-body connection is so important. So yeah, you can all do that. We can all do that individually and collectively and create space to do that for others.
Any other questions in the room? Don't be shy. Okay, I have one here. This is concerning housing. Carl, are you one of the collaborators looking at regional housing shortage issues? I read the St. Joe County Community Foundation with a Lilly grant did a housing study this year to identify the barriers to housing development. Will this study help move the county to create affordable housing or pressure private builders to build affordable housing instead of huge houses in subdivisions? What can St. Joe County citizens do to support the creation of affordable housing? This is for both of you.
So at the county level, so we're talking St. Joseph County, the county also released their master plan that included housing, and they recognized the need for that, especially with all the Amazon development that's going on at the western end of the county. And so if you go to the county website, you'll see that they identified areas north of Cleveland Road, beyond the South Bend City, where they want to do more affordable housing developments, and then down south of Erskine Plaza and south of Kern Road, they want to do some more affordable housing, and then also around North Liberty also they want to do some also. So they've identified a couple different areas that they want to do some more affordable housing, apartment complexes, not just large scale homes. And so that is the plan for workforce development. I'll say from the city level, we're committed to doing not just workforce housing, but affordable housing for 80% of average medium income, and then low income housing that would be 30 to 50% of average medium income. So affordable housing around $1,200 a month, low income housing $600 to $800 a month is what we're looking at doing. We currently have a project being built right now, the Diamond View Apartments right by Four Winds Field downtown, and Soma housing right across from Transpo that's being rehabbed also. That'll be affordable and low income units there. And then by Memorial Beacon Hospital, the Madison Lifestyle District will also in the future, next couple of years, be our next site for building more affordable housing. So the county has some broader plans, but the city also has steps we're currently taking to build more affordable and low income housing. In addition to partnering with the South Bend Housing Authority, we have a number of projects that we're working with them to build up their housing stock also.
And all the research shows that economically diverse ecosystems are central to combating poverty, right? Because you build different networks, you have different influences, different sort of connections you make, social connections that really build into your economic and other kinds of well-being too. I had an interesting conversation with an architecture professor at Notre Dame recently whose class, his students work with Habitat for Humanity and have developed some different projects and things. But he talked about them doing some work around close to campus where there's some of these big expensive houses that have been built recently. And there were some, when they were proposing some habitat housing there was a little resistance. But folks came around, like the concession or the compromise they figured out was that people didn't want the houses to look too different. So they did a little more aesthetic sort of matching to some of the things that were around, but it was more dense housing and such. So they found kind of a middle ground or a way to sort of ease into that for folks for whom that, that not in my backyard kind of resistance it could be strong. So thinking creatively, like how can we sit down and talk with people and introduce these concepts? And then the more you see it, right, the less strange or the less risky it seems to do that kind of integrative housing. So, it's good to see those conversations happen.
Yeah, and I think this is what you're saying, if I can just extend it even further, is that the church actually is this interesting place where it may not look like there's a ton of diversity, but there is often a ton of diversity. People with a number of different gifts, coming from a number of different backgrounds, can all be helping each other in this one place that we come to quite often. different generationally. We have older people giving wisdom to younger people helping. There's, in fact, as our homily said this morning, which I didn't give, it creates an ecosystem of helpfulness from a number of people who wouldn't necessarily come in contact with each other in such a personal way in other institutions. So actually the church can fill in some of those gaps with regards to helping each other.
Absolutely.
Any other? I have a question. How can I, to paraphrase, I want to do paperwork ministry. Where do I go to help people do that?
So Broadway Christian Parish has interns and volunteers who help people fill out applications for employment and for housing and to get their birth certificates and social security cards so they can get an ID to be able to apply for jobs and housing also. And so that would be one place that is able to do that. I know Motels for Now is working with people to get them signed up for disability, and there's some different agencies that are available to help people also with that. Places like St. Margaret's House, a day center for women, takes volunteers to work with people who need help with paperwork also for applications, is another great place to go. In the slides that the Reverend will post has my email, and I would encourage you to reach out. I can connect you with some of the other agencies. I can't think of the groups off the top of my head. And you can go to my website, southbendin.gov is the city website /homeless, and get all of my contact information and see a lot of the different resources and places that are available out there.
I also recommend the VITA program, Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. Maybe you can get trained to help folks file their income taxes. Another predatory sort of domain is the H&R Blocks and the tax assistance, folks who pop up suddenly in spring. That charge exorbitant fees to do a very simple income tax report.
VITA.
VITA, yeah. So you get trained. You don't have to be a math whiz. You can get trained on how to do it, and you can save folks a lot of money. Yeah.
Any last questions from in the room? Yeah, please.
So the problem is very big, and there are lots of smaller problems inside the problem. And so when you are looking at all of that, and basically, how do you not? What do you do when you feel despair creeping in about how big the problem is?
Yeah. So just to paraphrase the question, the problem seems very overwhelming, and what do you do when it feels so overwhelming that you're led to potential despair?
I'll say from the city side, it's encouraging to see how we're addressing all the different pieces. So like I've hit on mental health and some of the work that we're doing there. The city and the county both have opioid settlement funds that we've gotten from different pharmaceutical companies and medical providers because of the fentanyl and opioid addictions that weren't well documented and consumer awareness that was given. And so we have funds that we're talking with different agencies about how do we help people with substance use for recovery, and how do we utilize those funds. And so it's encouraging to see the steps that we're taking in these different areas. And then I would say from a religious and spiritual side, we're in the Advent season, right? Where we're recognizing that God comes down to us, right? And the incarnation is that reminder that as messy and as problematic as our world is, it's not so bad that God wasn't willing to take on human flesh and come and dwell among us. And so that gives me hope in the midst of all the messiness and despair and problems that we face, is that we're reminded that we're not alone, that God not only loves us, but he's come to dwell with us, to be present among us, to experience all the hardship and difficulties that we afflict upon one another and on ourselves. And that gives me hope that, especially in this Christmas season when it's so dark and cold and snowy out, that God is still present and that God is at work. And that gives us a hope as followers of Jesus to know that he is with us and guiding us and present among us.
That's beautiful. Yeah. There are systems of oppression, but there are also systems of care and love as well. So, we have made incredible progress. So it's not perfect. We're fine tuning perhaps, some of these systems, but we have Medicare, we have Medicaid, we have systems in place, and they can be better. But yeah, look to the people again who show up, who care for each other. you don't change everybody's mind, but sometimes, you do. Folks show up and are cracked open, and just any one of those for me, those experiences is profound. We have students who could spend their time just seeking, big paying jobs or whatever, but who take their time to study poverty, to make a long drive out to the prison and spend time there. And there's a lot of good people in the world, so look to them as well, and show up on a Sunday night, and you're reminded of all the good that there is in the world, I think.
So I want to ask one more hard question before I ask Mother Jen to come up and pray for us to close out our night. I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the race component of all this, which we haven't necessarily touched on this evening. I don't really have a question. I'm just saying the question maybe is, how can we be attuned to the way that race plays into poverty, specifically with Northern Indiana, South Bend, Mishawaka in mind?
Yeah. Well, before I forget to say it, in the spring we have a Catholic Social Tradition Conference. It happens every 2 years, and this one is on Christian nationalism and really kind of taking on that role of sort of even religious-based racist kinds of initiatives that are alive and well in the world. So that's important to have, again, for hope. It's important to have folks attending to these systemic problems and acknowledging them and not hiding away from them, especially at places like Notre Dame, to take that on. It's fundamental to, the history of slavery is part of what's unique about, poverty in America, right? And why it's so intransigent. We've got Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, talking about incarceration as the new slavery, right? And we've just continue to invest in incarceration, which is racially based. It's not good for anyone, but it's obviously highly geared toward people are overrepresented in prison based on their race, right? So this is one of those huge intransigent problems. Women, you add every layer of vulnerability, and folks who have female and people of color are overrepresented. There are more people who are white who are poor, which sometimes people forget, but that's just in sheer numbers. But people of color are overrepresented in poverty. So it's an issue of justice, right? We will not get rid of poverty unless we get rid of racism and sexism and all those other ways that we discriminate against one another.
I think about the good work that the Restorative Justice Hub is doing with Delilah Huerta and others to try to break that school-to-prison pipeline and to address, at least in South Bend, what we see are disparities in terms of expulsions and suspensions for African-American boys, especially to find restorative ways to address problematic behaviors and to keep people in community where they can keep learning and be connected with others. And so that gives me hope to address that among the children and the youth. And then I think about, I do a lived experience group with people who are unhoused every month. And we recently were part of a state survey about diversity and equity and inclusion across the state. And it was encouraging to hear from people, they were all African-American, it happened to be in this group, talking about how they felt represented among the different agencies, places like Broadway and St. Margaret's House and Our Lady of the Road, that they see people who look like them who are serving and in leadership. And it's something that I would know I was intentionally about when I was leading Broadway, and I know it's true at other places, to not only reflect that, but to also elevate, employ, and allow to lead people with lived experience, especially when it comes from those racial backgrounds. And so I think that's what gives me hope also, is that while we do have that history of racial inequality and oppression and racism, that we are making sure that we are toward elevating and empowering people like Clara Ross, who runs Homes for Tracy. She's been homeless herself, older African-American female who now is housing 5 families at a time, providing 9 months of transitional housing, and has an incredible success rate. And it's because we have empowered her, we've given her the resources and the support that she needs, that she's able to lead this important ministry and be the face of that. And I think that's what helps make a difference also then, when people have that lived experience, have overcome that racism, who understand what that experience is like, when they're allowed to lead, when they have the authority and power to help direct what we do as a community. That's one of the other ways that we can address those inequalities.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Round of applause for Carl and Connie. Thank you so much for being here with us and having this discussion with us and helping us reflect on the community-wide aspects of this, but also the way the church can live its calling to worship well in the service of others. And Mother Jen, would you please pray for us?
I invite you all to get out your Book of Common Prayer. Sometimes and I have forgotten your name, I knew it at one point in time, but as this woman said, thank you. The problems can seem so huge, and there are problems within problems, that sometimes it can be difficult, I think, to even find the words to pray. And so I just wanted to take a moment to point you towards page 823 of the Book of Common Prayer. There's this whole section on prayers for the social order. So we have prayer number 27 for social justice, 28 in times of conflict, 30 for the unemployed. Numbers on the next page, number 35 for the poor and the neglected, 36 for the oppressed, 37 for prisons and correctional institutions. It might be a good practice during this time of waiting and hopeful expectation to make a spiritual practice of just kind of praying through this section, a little bit each day. And it gives us the words when sometimes we don't have the words. And so what I would like to do, since we have been focusing on South Bend, is to point us towards prayer number 33 on page 825 for cities. And I am just going to move the microphone away from my mouth a little bit so that I'm loud enough to lead you, but not loud enough to dominate. And I'd invite us to pray this prayer number 33 together. Heavenly Father, in your word, you have given us a vision of that holy city to which the nations of the world bring their glory. Behold and visit, we pray, the cities of the earth. Renew the ties of mutual regard which form our civic life. Send us honest and able leaders. Enable us to eliminate poverty, prejudice, and oppression, that peace may prevail with righteousness and justice with order, and that men and women from different cultures and with differing talents may find with one another the fulfillment of their humanity. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. See you all later.
Appreciate it. Thanks for your attention to this. I am going to be in touch with you.
Okay.
Because I don't know if you remember my story from when we met, but I came from Bristol,
where
Okay.
after 9.5 years, I had figured out, when people came to the stores and
Yeah.
said, I need money for X, Y, or Z, I knew the system there went well enough
Yeah.
to, be able to not just less money in the problem,
Right.
but to send them to resources that could be of more help.
Yeah.
And I just don't know that right now. It's
Yeah.
been my door, and they say, I need help, and I'm like, here's $30. And that's just really benefits of the problem.
Right. Right.
So I'd like to be, yeah, still like cost $30 at them.
Yeah, but that doesn't.
Yeah, but at the same time, say, is housing a problem? Here's where you need to go. And we have to think about it. This is a problem. So, thank you.
Oh, very good. Yeah, it's great to have Sydney at Broadway. Yeah. Yeah. It's a wonderful ministry. I learned a lot about 5 years there. Hi, I'll see you soon. Nice to meet you. Right. Exactly. That's right. That's right. That's one by your side. We can work on it together. Thank you very much. It's great to meet you. Yeah.